June 19, 1944, over the Philippine Sea just after dawn. Warm, salt-heavy air presses against cockpits as pilots of the mobile fleet lift from their decks and climb into a pale, hazed blue sky. A veteran in an A6M Zero notes the humid breath of the engine, the thin metallic rattle of 7.7mm ammunition in the wings, and then, far off to the west, dark shapes rising in tiers. They look wrong. Broad-shouldered, square-jawed, carrying drop tanks, and still coming up hard. The first pass answers the question. Tracer lines bite and hold. 6 heavy .50 caliber Brownings hammering with a weight the Zero's skin and spars were never built to ignore. And he watches a comrade's wing shear into glittering fragments while the American fighter simply rakes through, rolls, and keeps climbing. By 0700, the sea below is invisible beneath contrails and turning wakes. Task Force 58's radar screens, SK sets sweeping, fighter directors cool-voiced, vector combat air patrols into layered intercepts above the carriers. F6F Hellcats take stations at altitude bands, their Pratt & Whitney R-2800s hauling them back up after every dive, their armor and self-sealing tanks soaking punishment that would have bled a Zero dry. Radio discipline frays on the Japanese nets as contacts multiply and bearings tangle. The veteran marks the Americans' speed, the steadiness in their zoom climbs, and feels a new pressure in his chest. The vertical is theirs now. By mid-morning, the phrase that history will choose has not yet been spoken, but its meaning, numerical weight, industrial weight, tactical weight, already hangs in the air with the smell of cordite. The shock on this morning began elsewhere, in drawing rooms and test flights. And to understand it, we must trace the quiet year that turned a prototype into the Navy's decisive answer. June 4th, 1942, Midway Atoll before sunrise. The Pacific a steel sheet under low cloud. In the cockpits of A6M Zeros, Japanese pilots breathe the cold tang of oxygen and trust the familiar truths of their craft. Light weight, long legs, and a turn that seems to pivot on a pin. They have seen American F4F Wildcats survive by grit and teamwork, but not by speed. That morning's clash, ragged, costly, decisive, signals a strategic bend in the road, and behind the headlines it pushes a technical question to the front of U.S. Navy minds. What kind of carrier fighter will dominate a war measured in oceans rather than channels? By August 1942, at Guadalcanal, the question takes on daily urgency. Henderson Field wakes each dawn to engine heat and coral dust. Wildcats scramble into knife fights where the A6M's agility punishes mistakes. Pilots like John Thatch blunt the edge with the weave, turning mutual support and radios into a weapon, and discipline salvages victories a lesser force would have lost. Yet the ledger is clear. The F4F4's top speed hovers around 320 mph, its climb lags, and the heavier 6-gun wing, with roughly 240 rounds per gun, means trigger time vanishes quickly. The Zero's reach and climb, its ability to dictate the first merge, forces Americans to dive away, zoom, regroup. Courage and tactics win days. They cannot change physics. In Washington, the Bureau of Aeronautics codifies the front line's verdict. The next fighter must climb harder, dive faster, carry 650 caliber Brownings with depth of ammunition, and come aboard a heaving deck again and again without bending a spar. It must have range for the Central Pacific, hundreds of miles out, fight and back, and a power plant that breathes in tropical altitudes. It must also be a teacher, stable enough to lift waves of new pilots from an expanding stateside pipeline into competence, then confidence. Grumman, already trusted for ruggedness, is told not merely to match the Zero's premise, but to erase it, by substituting armor for fragility, radios and radar direction for lone wolf initiative, and industrial repeatability for boutique craftsmanship. Japanese observers cannot see this shift yet. They still measure Americans by wildcats and weaves. But contracts are let, drawings harden, and on Long Island the outlines of a broader-shouldered answer take form, leading us toward the test stands where a prototype will soon meet the sky. June 26, 1942. Long Island's air is warm and insect bright. As Grumman's experimental XF6F1 lifts from Bethpage for the first time, its profile already broader and more muscular than the fighter it is meant to replace. The prototype's maiden climb proves the concept. A big wing with a thick, forgiving airfoil. A fuselage built not for delicacy, but for survival. And handling that suggests even a pilot with only a handful of carrier traps might bring it home. Yet almost before the test gear retracts, the Navy and Grumman agree on the decisive step: more power. By July, the F6F mounts Pratt & Whitney's 2,000 horsepower R2800 double wasp, a two-row radial that will define the Hellcat's character. Torque to break into the vertical, thrust to push through hot Pacific air at altitude, and a reliability that respects the loneliness of long-range missions over empty ocean. The production F6F emerges with 6 Browning M2.50 caliber guns. No mixed armament. No question about hitting power, fed by roughly 400 rounds per gun, giving a pilot almost a full minute of total trigger time. Maximum speed approaches 380 mph near 23,000 feet, and a climb rate around 3,500 feet per minute reshapes the geometry of escape and pursuit. External tanks stretch operational legs beyond 1,000 miles, giving task forces reach enough to hunt in the Central Pacific rather than just defend. The hydraulically folding stow wing hinges show Grumman's deck sense. Tight storage for crowded carriers, wide track gear for sure-footed landings, and a tall stance that forgives imperfect approaches by rookies who will soon fill the fleet. Armor plate behind the cockpit, bullet-resistant glass, and self-sealing fuel tanks answer everything Guadalcanal taught in fire and funerals. Pilots find they can trade blows, dive fast without shedding wings, and zoom back upward with authority. Boom and zoom tactics that seize the vertical initiative the Zero once owned. Later, F6F refinements tighten aerodynamics, and night fighter variants add APS-6 radar, turning darkness from risk into opportunity. Japanese accounts after early encounters note the shock. Cannon hits that used to cripple Wildcats now thud into this new American, and the fight continues. Shallow climbs that once invited pursuit now stretch into impossible distance. This machine is not just metal and rivets, it is a carrier-ready platform for fighter direction, radios, and mass training, a design whose brains match its blunt force. The blueprint is set, and as the summer of 1943 nears its peak, the Navy prepares to let the Hellcat test its promise in combat, beginning with the first patrols that will introduce a new shape to Pacific skies. August 31st, 1943, Northwest Pacific sky. High clouds streaking above the USS Essex's wake as fighters of VF-9 sit armed and restless on the deck. They launch with the first light, external tanks slung under their bellies, heading for Marcus Island, a speck of coral and concrete held deep in the Japanese perimeter. The F6F Hellcats move steadily into climbing cruise, their Pratt & Whitney radials droning a deeper note than the Wildcats they replaced. At altitude, the escort fighters sweep ahead of dive bombers and torpedo planes, meeting scattered opposition. It is September 1st when the first confirmed combat comes. Zeros rising from Marcus attempt to claw into position, expecting to confront the slower, shorter-legged Americans of a year before. Instead, the new Grummans dive through, fire with the weight of 650s, and climb back to station still above the bombers. Pilots later remark at how much energy remains after a firing pass, enough to deny the Japanese any chance to reverse the chase. The initial claims remain debated, as all aerial tallies are, but the impression among defenders is immediate. These intruders are faster, heavier, and harder to shake. October 5 to 6. 1943, Wake Island's battered airfields brace under renewed carrier raids. Hellcats from multiple decks now form fighter sweeps that press ahead of the strike groups, hunting reconnaissance types and scrambling fighters alike. When interceptors rise, they find Americans already with height and the freedom to choose when to engage. Reports from Wake describe the Hellcats' capacity to dive through the enemy's formation without structural complaint, then return to altitude in time to guard the bombers' withdrawal. American losses remain limited despite repeated attacks on a fortified target, a sharp contrast to the costlier escort missions of 1942. On Japanese radios, Controllers hear the pattern. The attackers arrive high, stay high, and still have fuel to patrol over their own ships afterward. For Essex's deck crews and squadron leaders, these raids validate not only the fighter's performance, but the practical demands of maintaining the new type at sea. Nothing about Marcus or Wake decides the war, yet the trajectory is clear. The Hellcat has earned its place, and that course now bends toward Rabaul, where land-based veterans will deliver a far sterner test in layered defenses above a fortress of the South Pacific. Late October 1943, Rabaul's morning haze lifts above Simpson Harbor as ground crews of the 11th Air Fleet ready A6M5s and dive bombers for another day of interception duty. The previous weeks have brought unsettling encounters with a new Grumman type, a fighter heavier and faster than the familiar Wildcats. Pilots returning from clashes near Bougainville complain that 20mm cannon bursts fail to tear open the intruder's body. Self-sealing tanks shrug off strikes that once turned Americans into falling torches. In debriefing rooms, aviators sketch its profile from memory. Broad wings, a deep belly, a blunt nose, hiding a powerful radial engine that claws upward even while burdened with external tanks. Attempts to lure the enemy into tight-turning duels often end in frustration as the Americans simply break away, climb back into the sun, and reappear with perfect timing. By the final days of October, intelligence officers file cautious reports to Tokyo. They note heavier gun batteries, 650, caliber guns judging from impact patterns, and improved armor. Around the cockpit that prevents easy pilot kills. Radio direction is now evident. American formations arrive stacked at multiple altitudes, responding quickly to radar cues rather than milling into equal numbers combat above the target. Copies of these assessments cross desks in the capital, where German naval attachés, sharing Axis liaison, add their own impressions. A new U.S. Navy carrier fighter, driven by a radial engine of roughly 2,000 horsepower, appears to be entering mass production. The operational strain grows more visible at Rabaul's airfields. Fuel stocks thin, spare parts lag weeks behind, and attrition bites hardest among veterans trained since China and 1941. Aircraft that limp home with damage clutter the dispersal bays, while younger pilots cycle into cockpits they barely know. Underneath the technical language of official summaries lies a sharper feeling. Respect for a strong opponent mingled with concern that the balance has shifted. The Americans are not merely fighting harder. They are fighting smarter, arriving high, choosing terms, and departing with fuel left to guard their own fleet. As November approaches, U.S. carriers turn directly toward New Britain, preparing audacious strikes against Rabaul itself, where flak, seasoned interceptors, and fortress density will put the Hellcats' rising reputation to its most severe test yet. In the same months when new Hellcats first tested their claws over Marcus and Wake, another transformation gathered force far from combat. At Bethpage and Calverton on Long Island, Grumman's factories, already known among sailors as the Iron Works for their relentless pace, shifted from cautious prototype runs to a streamlined flood. The engineering decisions baked into the F6F's bones paid dividends now. Rugged systems that forgave rough handling, standardized parts that slotted together without fuss, and a folding wing that packed densely on hangar decks. By early 1943, production methods matured to the point where entire carrier air groups could re-equip in weeks, not years, a feat the Japanese Empire could scarcely imagine sustaining. Railways rolled airframes westward in long, tarp-covered convoys, while naval air stations from Rhode Island to Florida trained pilots on a common syllabus built around radios, formation discipline, and gunnery with 650 calibers. Ferry pilots then hopped the fresh aircraft across the continent to West Coast depots, where squadrons took custody and deck crews baptized them in the routines of carrier life, cycling engines, folding wings, slinging drop tanks, and loading gun belts that arrived with a reliability foreign to their opponents. The numbers speak plainly. From 1942 to 1945, Grumman delivered more than 12,000 Hellcats, enough to ensure that every loss at the front was a logistical pulse, not a strategic wound. Across the Pacific, Japanese maintenance officers counted each airframe like a precious heirloom. Supply lines stretched thin from the home islands to Truk and Rabaul. Spares trickled in. Veteran pilots dwindled. A lost Zero often meant a lost ace, and the replacement arrived late and green. Meanwhile, American fast carriers sailed with holds full of propellers, barrels, and power plants, their flight decks stacked with aircraft that could launch, fight, recover, and launch again before sunset. That industrial rhythm gave substance to the evolving doctrine of fighter direction. Enough Hellcats to sweep ahead, escort the strike, and still guard the fleet afterward. As November 1943 approached, the Iron Works' steady output turned into tactical leverage. When the carriers pointed their bows toward Rabaul, one of Japan's most formidable strongholds, they did so confident not only in the Hellcats' design, but in the assurance that replacements, fuel, and ammunition stood ready to sustain a new tempo of war. The next blows would show what that abundance meant when thrown against the beating heart of the South Pacific. Defenses, November 5, 1943. Morning light breaks across the volcanoes encircling Simpson. Harbor as a wave of Hellcats surges ahead of U.S. Navy strike aircraft. The Essex, Bunker Hill, and Independence-class carriers have crept within range under the cover of night, their pilots briefed to tear into one of Japan's most vaunted strongholds. Veteran Zero pilots from elite air groups scramble from Lakanai and Tobera airfields, confident in familiar home skies. Yet the first merges run against expectations. The new Grummans drop into steep dives through intercept attempts, unleash concentrated bursts from 6 Brownings, then climb back toward the bombers before defenders can latch on. Survivors report that cannon hits spark but fail to cripple the enemy. Armor and sealed tanks keep the Hellcats in the fight. Below, strike groups press onward. Bombs and torpedoes find heavy cruisers by their moorings. Columns of water and fire leap up among ships that once dominated the South Pacific. Japanese squadron logs from this day tell of experienced pilots lost in sudden defeats, their replacements younger, less assured, and overwhelmed by the coordinated American altitude stacks that radar and radios choreograph with growing precision. Though fog and smoke obscure the exact tally, both sides recognize the imbalance. U.S. aircrews return to their decks with modest losses, while defenders lose cadres honed since China and Pearl Harbor. 6 days later, November 11th, the carriers return. The aura that shielded Rabaul in the imagination has already cracked. Hellcats once again sweep in first, forming a guard that allows bombers to thread into the harbor's heart and hammer at warships and infrastructure alike. The defenders fight bitterly, but their ability to dictate engagements erodes further. For U.S. commanders, the lesson is unmistakable. The Hellcat can escort, control the vertical, and still protect the fleet in the same operation. Tasks that cost dearly in 1942 now executed in one continuous rhythm. Rabaul does not fall in a day, but its mystique does. The shock that began over peripheral islands now reaches the fortress itself, proving that American carriers can strike deep and return whole. Ahead lies the next test, farther west, in the Central Pacific, where in February 1944, the Navy will challenge another bastion whose very name haunts Japanese planning, Truk Lagoon. February 17, 1944, before sunrise, the decks of Task Force 58 glow under hooded lamps as Hellcats launch into pre-dawn darkness. Drop tanks slung beneath them for the long reach to Truk. This vast lagoon, once feared as the Gibraltar of the Pacific, lies ahead cloaked in scattered cloud. Radar controllers aboard the fast carriers guide the first fighters toward Eton and Moen, where revetments and runways still bristle with the remnants of Japan's Central Pacific air strength. As the horizon grays, American pilots sweep low over palm-lined strips, guns chattering into parked aircraft while others climb to guard the heights. When the first A6Ms burst upward, they find the intruders already stacked in layers, free to dive, fire, and reclimb into ambush positions. Throughout the morning of February 17th, the rhythm becomes unmistakable. Intercept attempts stall beneath American altitude, the defenders burn fuel in futile climbs, and Hellcats punch through their formations with brief, decisive bursts from 6 heavy guns. Pilots later recall the ease with which they reset the fight. No lingering in turns, no equal-footed contests. Vertical separation becomes a weapon, and acceleration back into the sun turns seconds into dominance. Below, strike waves tear into shipping anchored in the lagoon. Dive bombers and torpedo planes, screened by vigilant escorts, cripple cruisers and transports alike. Columns of black smoke rise among coral islets that once anchored Japanese ambition. By February 18th, the outcome has hardened into fact. Wrecked aircraft litter the airfields. The surviving defenders retreat into scattered pockets of resistance. Truck's capacity to project power is shattered, its reputation as a forward bastion undone in 48 hours. What impresses observers most is not only the Hellcat's brute force, but the system behind it: radar direction. Practiced formations, steady replacement flows, each sortie a link in a chain of industrial and tactical superiority. With truck neutralized, the fast carriers are free to leap across the Central Pacific. Ahead lie the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, and the promise of airfields for B-29s that can reach the home islands. The step from truck to those islands will provoke the decisive test that opened our story, whether the Hellcat, now present in mass and proven in battle, can break the spine of Japan's carrier air arm in a single campaign. Spring 1944. Across the Central Pacific, the war's balance shifts not only in factories and fuel stores, but in the minds of the men strapped into roaring machines. At American naval air stations from Florida to California, new pilots cycle through a standardized syllabus built around the Hellcat's strengths. Wide-track gear that forgives awkward deck landings, an engine that hauls them out of danger with steady torque, and radio procedures drilled until instinctive. They graduate in waves, confident that the aircraft beneath them will survive a mistake, a stray cannon hit, or a rough trap. This confidence becomes a quiet weapon. Pilots take risks they once avoided, knowing the odds favor a return to their ship and another sortie before dusk. For the Japanese, the same months mark a thinning of the veteran corps that once defined their naval air service. Many aces who fought from China to Guadalcanal fall at Rabaul or vanish into the sea off Truk. Those who survive carry wounds, fatigue, and the knowledge that each new sortie may be their last with no equivalent replacement waiting behind. Green pilots arrive from accelerated training programs that lack fuel, instructors, and the time needed to build combat judgment. They climb into A6Ms that demand precision and nerve, meeting opponents who refuse the traditional turning duel. Instead, the Americans appear above, dive once with heavy guns blazing, then climb away still fast, an act that demoralizes even before the cannon shells find their mark. Diary fragments from Rabaul and Saipan later hint at the psychological turn, acknowledgments that the enemy arrives with altitude, numbers, and fuel, laments that the once reliable trick of drawing Americans low no longer brings advantage, surprise at aircraft that keep pulling upward after steep dives. On the carriers of Task Force 58, a different mood settles in. Deck crews slap the shoulder of a pilot whose machine returned with holes you could fit a hand through, and he grins as armorers reload his Brownings. Damage that would have been a fatal bill in 1942 now leads only to a night of repairs and the promise of another launch at dawn. By May 1944, the intangible balance is set. Veteran edge, once the Japanese trump card, is dulled against a system designed to preserve American skill and replenish loss without pause. Morale hardens into expectation. U.S. pilots expect to win, and Japanese pilots begin to fear that every climb ends beneath a Hellcat's guns. Both navies now steer toward the Marianas, where that shift in belief will matter as much as steel and horsepower. In June 1944, over the Philippine Sea, the contest will reveal whether psychological momentum can break a carrier air arm in a single day, June 19, 1944. Morning heat presses against the canopies of Hellcats circling above the Philippine Sea, their radios crackling with bearings fed from fighter direction teams aboard the fast carriers. Below lies an expanse of water without islands or landmarks, the kind of vast arena only a late-war fleet can command. The Japanese combined fleet has committed its carrier air groups to AGO, determined to hurl successive strike waves into the American lodgment in the Marianas. From decks hundreds of miles west, Zeros and attack aircraft launch into a sky already mapped by U.S. radars, SK sets sweeping high, SG sets combing the low approaches, giving Task Force 58 a picture of the battle long before men can see shapes on the horizon. Hellcats move first. They intercept inbound groups while they are still distant, slashing through with 650 calibers steady in long tracking bursts. Dive, fire, climb. The rhythm repeats as deck crews on the carriers below cycle fresh sections skyward. Japanese pilots, many newly assigned, try to knit formations under radio confusion, but altitude and timing always seem to favor the Americans. Bombers that survive the first cuts arrive fragmented, harried, and unsure of exactly where the U.S. task force lies. Some drop ordnance wide into the ocean. Others turn back trailing smoke. Pilots who once expected to dictate the fight now struggle to even find a target before another attack presses them down. June 20th continues the reversal. Japan's remaining groups are fed into the same grinder of radar. Direction and mast cap. Whatever tally later analysts assign, hundreds. Claimed in the sky or lost at sea, the irreversible truth settles across the waves. Japan's trained carrier aviation has been broken. Survivors write of interceptors that simply extend away from any attempt to turn, of a vast opponent whose decks remain hidden while guardians swirl unseen above. Strategically, the Marianas are secured, anchoring bomber fields that bring the home islands under direct threat. Tactically, the battle confirms every quiet decision made in 1942. Give a pilot visibility, endurance, and toughness enough to fight. Land, refuel, and launch again before dusk. The victory clears a path toward the Philippines, where land-based fighters, new tactics, and mounting desperation will test how quickly the Hellcat and its pilots can adapt to a changing war. Late 1944, the humid skies over the Philippines and Formosa tell a different story than the one written in the Philippine Sea. Japan's newest fighters arrived not from carriers, but from hard-run airstrips inland. The Army's Kai-84 Hayate and the Navy's N-1K2J Shiiden-Kai represent the last burst of Japanese aeronautical innovation. Powerful engines, heavier cannon, and climbs that can match or even edge the Hellcat in the first moments after the merge. American pilots who had grown used to setting the pace now find opponents that, if given the initiative, can threaten with quick vertical punches and high-speed firing passes. One moment of carelessness can bring a 20mm burst slamming into cockpit armor, and crews aboard the fast carriers note the uptick in patching work after every sortie. The U.S. answer does not depend on dueling perfection. The F6F-5 arrives with refinements that matter in long campaigns, slightly higher speed thanks to cleaner aerodynamics, strengthened wings that carry 5-inch HVAR rockets and 1,000-pound bombs, and structural margins for repeated fighter-bomber sorties. Now, the Hellcat spends mornings escorting and clearing airspace, afternoons pounding airfields into cratered wastelands before new Japanese types can scramble. Suppression becomes a strategy. With each attack, aircraft burn on the ground, pilots are lost without ever reaching combat, and the window in which a Kai-84 or Shiiden-Kai can show its teeth narrows. Adaptation spreads to the night as well. The F6F-5N mounts the compact APS-6 radar, letting pilots stalk intruders through tropical darkness. These night fighters blunt harassment raids and preserve the tempo of daylight operations. Meanwhile, daytime squadrons enforce a stricter discipline. No flat turns, no chases into bait, always boom and zoom with wingmen ready to pounce when a Japanese ace tries to reverse the fight. Patience and coordination become lethal tools, drawing ambitious climbers into positions where radar vectors and altitude stacks can finish them. Japanese airmen recognize both the opportunity and the trap. A Kai-84 might leap skyward with startling acceleration, but within seconds the sky fills with more Hellcats, each guided by radios and strategy honed over years of gain and loss. A late-war duel no longer decides a front. Numbers, logistics, and doctrine weigh every engagement. The Hellcat never pretends to be the ideal single combat champion. Yet it remains the right weapon for the fleet, the aircraft that bends battle to its strengths rather than chasing perfection on the edge of Performance. These adaptations carry the war into October 1944, as massive air battles over Formosa and the sweeping arcs of Leyte Gulf prove that the Hellcat can destroy, escort, and suppress in one relentless surge, setting conditions for the decisive advance toward Japan's inner defenses. October 12, 1944, before sunrise, the sea around Task Force 38 flickers with signal lamps as Hellcats lift from carrier decks, their drop tanks heavy with fuel for the long strike toward Formosa. The objective is clear: neutralize the island's air power before the coming landings in the Philippines. Dawn finds F6Fs sweeping low over runways at Shinchiku and Matsuyama, strafing revetments and parked aircraft while others climb to altitude to intercept the inevitable counterattack. Flak blooms thick and black beneath them, and the defenders rise. Updated Zero variants alongside newer land-based fighters determined to push the attackers back into the sea. The battle echoes through the day. Hellcats that begin as escorts for bombers soon pivot into fighter sweeps, diving through climbing interceptors and shattering cohesion before the Japanese can mass. When the sky briefly clears, they drop down again to rake taxiways and dispersal areas where mechanics scramble to make machines ready. Many return to their carriers with fuel still in the tanks, enough to rotate into the combat air patrol and guard the task force, while armorers reload guns and deck crews slam fresh tanks into place. Each squadron lives a continual cycle: launch, fight, refuel, fight again, turning daylight into pressure that never releases. Japanese commanders throw counterstrokes from bases across the island, but their formations fray against radar-directed fighters that reappear at altitude faster than expected. Radio confusion and uneven coordination erode the effectiveness of every wave. On October 14th and 15th, the pattern deepens. Aircraft burn on the ground in growing numbers. Veteran pilots are lost to quick, brutal merges, and the capacity to generate powerful interceptions drains by the hour. What had once been a bastion between the American fleet and the Philippines becomes a proving ground for endurance, and endurance favors the side with replacements and planning. By October 16th, the American tally lists dozens of enemy aircraft destroyed in the air and many more ruined on the ground. For the Japanese, the reckoning is harsher. Units already stretched by months of attrition enter the final defense of the Philippines with fewer aircraft, fewer veterans, and a growing sense of inevitability. The tempo from Formosa flows directly south and west. Within days, the sprawling Battle of Leyte Gulf will erupt, and on October 24th, individual Hellcat sorties will carve their own legends into a clash meant to break Japan's remaining naval air power. October 24th, 1944. Dawn spreads over the Philippine Sea as Task Force 38's decks thunder to life. Hellcats rise into a sky already crowded with stakes. The Japanese combined fleet is maneuvering to crush the landings at Leyte, and every squadron understands the scale. The first merges come high, where thin light flares off canopies and contrails mark hard turns. F6F-5s, nose-high and gentle climbs, cut across Zeros and newer interceptors trying to break through to the torpedo bombers. 6 Brownings fire in long, steady strokes. One pass, sometimes two, decides the matter. Pilots who have learned months of discipline refuse flat duels. They dive, fire, extend away, and re-enter with altitude still to spare. The day spirals into a moving battle across hundreds of miles. Over water, chases skim so low that wakes ripple beneath the wingtips. Escort sections dive through enemy formations to clear the path for bombers hunting the battleship Musashi, then swing south to strafe airfields that feed the fight. Enemy pilots try to assemble into disciplined intercepts, but radar-guided Hellcats appear from above and behind, scattering their timing. Reports from Japanese air crews describe sudden ambushes, American fighters arriving too high to counter, vanishing into the layered cap before defenders can bring guns to bear. Confusion grows as bearings twist and altitude calls fail to match what eyes see. Through midday, strikes pound at surface forces, and every return to the carriers brings refuel, rearm, and relaunch, a tempo impossible to match from the shrinking airfields of Luzon. Each engagement removes another fragment of the veteran corps that once steadied Japanese naval aviation. The attrition that began over Formosa now accelerates. Squadron rosters thin into gaps that green replacements cannot fill. Hellcat pilots feel the shift not as triumph but as routine. They fly their assignments, trust their machines, and launch again at the next signal. By evening, surface actions off Samar and in the Philippine Sea draw the world's attention. Yet the air battles of October 24th, swift, repeated, sometimes anonymous, cut the shield meant to protect those Japanese warships. The Hellcat proves itself an all-day, all-task fighter for a fleet driving west at unstoppable pace. Ahead lies a final transformation in the struggle for the Pacific. Japan will turn to special attack tactics and new last-ditch aircraft, and the Hellcat's next trial will measure not only interception and escort, but endurance against the most desperate threat the war can summon. Early 1945, the Pacific War contracts to its fiercest edges, and the Hellcat remains the principal fighter of the fast carriers as they strike at the last gateways to Japan. In February and March, F6Fs thunder above the black sand of Iwo Jima, escorting bombers and diving onto pillbox clusters, while radar-directed patrols fend off desperate counterattacks from nearby islands. The mission is unglamorous and essential. Keep pressure constant so that Marines can grind forward and B-29s soon have a haven on the doorstep of the home islands. The Hellcat's forgiving approach, speeds, and rugged undercarriage remain virtues on crowded decks, where losses from operational mishaps once loomed as large as enemy action. Now, routine competence keeps the fleet's offensive rhythm unbroken. April brings a larger crucible: Okinawa. Here, the war's character mutates into a relentless defense against massed special attack sorties. Radar picket stations ring the invasion fleet, lonely and exposed, and it is the Hellcat, launching again and again, that defends them. Pilots speak of endless hours, eyes stinging from strain, as fighter direction controllers vector them toward incoming groups. They drop tanks, dive into the path of kamikaze charges, unleash heavy .50 caliber fire at closing range, then claw back upward to meet the next warning. F6F-5Ns prowl the nights with APS-6 radar, breaking up raiders before they glimpse a target's wake. By day, fighter bombers streak north to Kyushu, firing HVAR rockets and dropping bombs onto airfields to choke raids before they rise. For Japanese aviators, many in machines fueled by fast-dwindling reserves, the oppression grows total. Training is rushed. Losses accumulate before pilots finish a handful of combat sorties, and fuel shortages chain aircraft to the ground. What began as shock in late 1943 becomes certainty. The sky belongs to a foe whose aircraft is only the visible edge of a system that finds you early, outlasts you, and returns in waves. By the summer of 1945, the Hellcat has flown in every mode the fleet required: escort, sweep, strike, night guard, and picket shield. Claims run high, but the deeper legacy lies in its conversion of carrier air power from daring raids into a sustained offensive machine. When August 15th ends the war, the aircraft that first proved itself over Marcus and Rabaul, then shattered Japan's carrier air arm in the Marianas, finishes the fight over Okinawa's storm-torn sea. Its arc closes where our story began, with the realization, felt first by the defenders, that a new kind of sky had come to stay. June 19, 1944, back to the morning light over the Philippine Sea, where the first warning crackles across a Japanese radio and a wingman looks up to see contrails folding into the sun. In earlier years, a steep climb had promised escape. The Zero's wings would bite the air and carry a pilot into safety above the fight. Now that climb delivers only a new adversary rising hard behind him, broad-nosed and implacable, its engine still pulling in the thin air. The burst that once tore open Wildcats thuds instead against armor plate. Fuel that should spill and flame stays sealed, and the American simply keeps coming. This moment contains everything the years had built. It is Guadalcanal's bitter lessons hammered into requirements. Long Island's factories turning drawings into thousands of machines, and Rabaul and Truck teaching pilots that teamwork and altitude would rule the next phase of war. It is deck crews whose practiced hands make the exceptional routine, and fighter directors who turn radar sweeps into altitude traps that feel like fate. The Hellcat is not a miracle. It is a system made manifest in aluminum and steel, skilled people working in concert to change how combat unfolds. For those who faced it, shock soon hardened into inevitability. The sky became a place where initiative slipped away, where even home airfields could not guarantee the first move. When peace finally returned and the carriers went quiet, the verdict was already written in those mid-air collisions of will and machine. The Hellcat had changed the rules, and with them the war's ending.